They told me my husband was dead on a Wednesday a little before lunch, and 2 hours later my phone lit up with his face and a voicemail where his voice, breathy and steady in a way I knew down to the bones, said, "Nora, listen to me. Trust no one." Not yet. And then a pause like he was weighing how to say the words he couldn't bear to speak before the recording cut out, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a dish towel in my hands and the sound of the fridge humming like nothing had changed when everything had. And the oddest detail is that the towel had little lemons on it, printed bright and cheery, and my daughter Mia had picked it out with me at the big box store because it made the kitchen look happy. Which is about as far from that moment as you can imagine, because I felt the air go thin and the floor tilt a little like you feel on those cheap carnival rides you swear you'll never go on again. The morning had started ordinary. Coffee in my chipped blue mug, the one Evan bought me at a craft fair the summer we had to dodge wasps while we ate kettle corn. The kids arguing about who had to feed the dog, me hustling them into jackets and out to the car in high-top sneakers and bed hair. Both of them groaning when I reminded them we had the dentist after school, and Evan had kissed the top of my head in the doorway like he often did when my hands were full, murmuring, "Back by 6, Mama." Don't forget the Little League sign-up, smelling faintly of sawdust, and that cedar soap he liked, a smell that clung to his hoodie hanging on the peg by the garage like a ghost you don't shoo away. And he had said he was meeting a client on the north side near the new developments, rolling his eyes in that way that meant he felt like he was constantly justifying schedules and bids, and all the things you have to keep straight when you manage crews and fight with suppliers. He walked down the driveway in the brisk light, and I remember the way his shadow stretched across the frost-tipped grass, and the mail truck passed, and the driver waved, because it was that kind of neighborhood where you waved, and you knew who made the best brownies at the PTA bake sale, and who bought too many inflatable decorations every holiday, and who had a new baby, and who needed casseroles. And I stood there with my coffee, warming my fingers, watching him back out of the drive, accompanied by the gentle thump of the ball as Sam took shots at the hoop we'd put up on the side of the garage, his hair sticking up, his backpack half open because he never really learned to zip it all the way. And Mia, smaller and solemn sometimes in the way she took in the world, had tied a pink ribbon to her stuffed raccoon and was giving me biographies of its day as we climbed into the minivan. We did the school drop-off, me hugging them both through the front seat, the line inching forward while my favorite crossing guard in the neon vest called out, "No rolling stops." And I promised Sam I would bring the cleats to practice because he'd forgotten them again. And I went home thinking about nothing more than whether to thaw chicken or pick up rotisserie, and how we had that fundraiser next Tuesday, and I needed plastic forks. When the knock came, echoes of a door knocker, and there were two men in uniform with that expression that makes you know they wouldn't be there if it wasn't bad. And the air in my chest seemed to move backward, and the older one, a Captain Maybe, asked, "Mrs. Hale?" And I said yes, because I am, and he asked if he could come in, and I said no, because I needed to hear whatever it was standing up. And he said there had been a multi-vehicle wreck at the interchange near the new construction site, that a pickup registered to Evan had been involved, that it had caught fire. A word that made me see things I didn't want to see. He quickly added that they had found his wallet and his ring thrown from the wreck, but the fire had been significant. That he was presumed dead, because no one had walked away who had been in that cluster of cars, and there were still investigators on scene. But they needed immediate family to be notified. And it was like a script that suddenly applied to us and not some other poor soul. And I stood very still and stared at the lemon towel, and said thank you because there is nothing else you can say to that. And they gave me a card and asked if there was someone they could call, and I said my sister. And they stood there while I called Lena, and I heard my voice go very flat, like I was reading myself a grocery list, saying, "It's Evan. The police are here. They think he's gone." And then they left, and I sank onto the floor just because the floor was solid, and if I stayed standing I might float away, and the world was too bright, and the dog came over with his soft head and rested it on my knee like he knew something had gone wrong. And I remember looking up at the calendar with the school picture wedged next to a flyer for the neighborhood potluck, and thinking we had planned to bring coleslaw and maybe no one would need my coleslaw. And it's a weird thought, but grief is like that. It makes some brain pathways fire, and the rest go silent. My sister arrived in a flurry of coat and concern, and held me while I started to shake. And then the questions I hadn't asked yet started to arrive like birds to a feeder, and I couldn't hold them all. The practical ones, who to call and what to say to the kids, and what we do without a service with no body, and what to do with the toothbrush that has to be left where it is because moving it would make all this too real. And we do what people do in those moments. We made tea. We called his mother. We folded our hands around mugs because warm things make cold facts more bearable. And then I had to leave to get the kids because I couldn't bear the thought of them standing on the sidewalk waiting in that high afternoon light with the stroller brigade and the dogs and the little groups who gather. And so I pulled into the school pickup lane too early and just sat there in the creeping line wishing I could stop time. And when Sam and Mia climbed in, I couldn't say it right away. Not in the safety of that line with the chatter and the notes about Red Ribbon Week and the teacher waving from the curb. I waited until we got home, and I sat them on the couch, and I took both of their hands and I told them that there had been an accident, that Daddy's truck had been in it, that the police thought he had died, that sometimes bodies don't come home right away, the words catching and not quite making sense, and Sam blinked hard and asked, "Are you sure?" And I said that I didn't want it to be true, and that we would hold on to each other no matter what. And Mia, who is small and fierce, climbed into my lap and pressed her ear to my chest like she was listening to see if my heart was still there. And then there were casseroles and texts, and people being kind in the ways they know how. Tasha from the PTA dropping off a tray of baked ziti and a pile of paper plates. Malik from 2 houses down mowing our lawn without asking. Pastor June phoning just to leave a prayer on voicemail because she knew I'd be overwhelmed. And a blur of early evening where time felt thick and every minute stretched and folded back on itself. And in that same blur, after I had finally convinced the kids to lie down with their stuffed animals and a nightlight because darkness felt too big, my phone lit on the counter with a number that was too familiar to be real. Evan's contact photo, his smile captured on a ferry ride last summer, hair blown wild by the wind. And my hands went cold as I answer swipe, but it goes straight to voicemail. And then the little red dot, and I pressed play and heard him say my name in a whisper, "Nora." And then, "Listen to me. Trust no one, not the police, not Ken, not anyone at Harbor Ridge. Take the kids to Plan B, I'll find you." And then a click and the recording ended, and the kitchen looked the same as it had looked when I was sure he was gone. And I leaned both hands on the counter and braced against the edge like I might slide if I didn't. And my first thought wasn't even that maybe he was alive. It was that voice, his voice, and the way he said, "Plan B." Because that was our ridiculous joke from the first year of marriage when a storm knocked out power for 3 days, and we realized we'd never put an emergency kit together. So we made this little list and called it Plan B. And it included such practical things as where to meet if phones died, the children's section of the library, and the code we'd use if one of us was ever in trouble, red scarf, because of a scarf I wore on our second date. And I remember laughing then, because what were the odds we'd need a code? Who were we, spies? And now I had this voicemail and my husband had told me not to trust the men who had just stood in my kitchen. And I could have been angry, but mostly I was suddenly awake, every sense lit. I wanted to play it again, to be sure, and I did. And then I looked at the timestamp and my stomach dropped because it had come in less than an hour before, long after the accident, if there was an accident at all. And I had the kids asleep and the casseroles on the counter with names written on masking tape, so I could return the Pyrex. And the dog thumped his tail like this was any other night. And I found my keys, and I woke up Lena, who had fallen asleep sitting up with her mouth open because she always does that and I've teased her about it since we were 10, and I said, "He called." And she snapped awake with, "What?" And I said, "Voicemail, he said. He said to trust no one. Leave with the kids," and she held onto the back of a chair and breathed deep like she was bracing against a swell and then nodded and said, "Okay, Plan B." And I laughed a little because it was absurd, and because laughter felt like the only thing keeping me from sobbing again, and said, "Plan B." And we moved quietly through the house, and I grabbed the folder with our documents and some cash from the jar we used for ice cream money. And I filled a tote with toothbrushes and pajamas, and the yellow blanket Mia sleeps with, and the blue flannel shirt that Sam swears smells like his dad. And we drove to Lena's apartment across town, which is where I slid under her spare comforter, and stared at the ceiling fan making those shadows that travel around the room like ghost birds, while my mind replayed the way Evan said, not Ken, and thought of Ken Malone, his boss, who had called earlier to offer condolences and had asked, "And if you could bring Evan's laptop by the office. No rush, of course. We need to keep projects moving," which had seemed practical until it came through the filter of his voice on that recording. I didn't sleep, not really, just drifted and sat up again and drifted. And at dawn, while the sky was a shallow gray and the world felt quiet in that way it only does between 5 and 6 a.m., I went back to our house to shower and feed the dog and see whether the place looked different in the light of this new information. And there was the neighbor, Greg, a retired cop with a daily habit of walking his shepherd at that hour whether you wanted to be chatty or not. And he waved and walked over because that's who he is, hearty and helpful, and said, "Hey there, Nora. Anything you need, you let me know. I've seen some stuff. I can help with the paperwork, for the, service." And I thanked him and watched his eyes track the house like he was assessing it for vulnerabilities. And I wondered if that's how retired cops always look at things, or if my mind was now trained to see threat in kindness. I showered, letting the water run until it steamed the mirror, and I could draw a smiley face with my finger, which Mia always likes to come in and add eyelashes, too. And then I stood wrapped in a towel and debated whether to call the number back, his number, and instead decided on a different kind of call, a person I thought I could trust. Ms. Alvarez, who does compliance audits and knows the city contracting process because she volunteers at our community center and once told me a story about a contractor who got caught padding invoices and how the cover-up took longer to untangle than the lie took to tell. I called her and said, "Do you have time to hear something complicated?" And she said, "I have time for you. What's going on?" And I told her some of it, not the whole thing, not yet, because I had that warning in my ear, the one that made my skin prickle when I thought of secrets being turned into weapons. She told me to hold on to anything of Evan's that had to do with work, not to hand over the laptop, not to sign anything until I had a lawyer. And I hung up and looked at the laptop on his desk like it was a snake and a lifeline both, me feeling the hardwood under my bare feet and the coffee machine burbling on the counter and the normalcy of those sounds ringing weird in the same day I'd been told I was a widow. I went to his office and stood there and breathed in the smell that's 1,000 little pieces of him. A whiff of engine oil, sawdust, cedar, the faint tang of printer ink. And I reached for the drawer where he kept his gum and found a folded note hidden flat against the wood like it wanted to lie invisible. The tape yellowed from years. And it said, "N, if this ever goes wrong," in his handwriting that always slants up like he's walking uphill. And there was a small key taped to it with C12 written on the tag in Sharpie. And my heart did a slow tumble because he had thought this through in the way he thinks things through when it matters. Like when he packed the diaper bag better than me, and always had an extra snack because he believed in the gospel of being prepared. And I hid the note in my bra like I was 13 and hiding love poems, which is a ridiculous place to put a key. But it felt safe. And I texted Lena that I had to run an errand, and I drove to the storage facility on the edge of town where C12 would be, and I felt that half-panicked giddy energy that happens when you're about to do something brave or stupid, and you can't tell which. And the woman in the office looked at me like I was just another customer with a late fee as she slid the clipboard over, and I signed a name I hardly recognized as my own, because who is Nora Hale, likely widow? And I walked down the corridor with the rumble of the overhead lights and the smell of dust and something sweet like old cardboard, and the key slid in like it had been waiting for me. And inside C12 was a stack of plastic boxes that could have been Christmas decorations, but weren't. And there was a duffel with clothes shoved in like he had thrown them together in a hurry, and a shoebox with some cash and what looked like a burner phone, and a heavy binder with Harbor Ridge, embossed on it in scraps of paper tucked into the pockets, and a flash drive in one of those tiny manila envelopes like you'd buy at a tiny office supply aisle. And I stood there with my heart hammering, and the door rattling slightly because of the draft and thought, "Okay, Evan, I see your plan B." And then I heard footsteps and I froze and someone peered around the corner and it was Greg with his friendly shepherd and he said, "Oh hey, didn't know you rented a unit out here. Need a hand?" and the shepherd's tail wagged like we were all friends, and I thought, how did he find me here? And then reminded myself that it's a small town and maybe he has a unit too, and maybe he saw my car in the lot and maybe he was being kind. But his eyes did that assessing sweep again, and I felt like an open book in a library full of people who might not be reading for the right reasons. And I pasted a smile and said, "It's just baby clothes and some old chairs," which is both plausible and exactly what you hide in storage units. And he offered to help carry, and I said, "No, I'm fine, thanks." And as soon as he pivoted the dog's leash back toward the hallway, I slid the flash drive into my pocket and closed the unit with a clang that echoed, and tried to look like I was closing up a chapter of my life and not opening a brand new one. At home, I plugged the flash drive into our old desktop because it lives in the kitchen and felt safer than doing this on his laptop, which felt watched. And it lit up with spreadsheets and PDFs and emails that made my head swim. Work orders and purchase orders and chain of custody documents where numbers didn't match. A column called adjustment that repeated over and over with neat little percentages. And a list of consultants who didn't have real addresses. Just mailboxes in the plaza behind the nail salon. And I scrolled and I thought of Evan's face when he gets frustrated with something that doesn't fit. That determined half-smile he wears when he's about to solve the thing and bring it to me with a flourish like a kid with a science fair project. And I heard his voice from 100 kitchen conversations, saying, "If you follow the money, you find the rot." And then my phone vibrated and it was Ken again, leaving a voicemail this time. Playing friendly and urgent, "Nora, just checking in. I know it's been a shock. If you want, I'll send someone over to help gather Evan's equipment. Also, I need the passcodes to his project files so we can keep timelines. You'll be taken care of. Call me." And I stopped the message and stared at the wall and felt the dog press against my leg. A small, warm weight that kept me here when everything else made me want to drive until the road ran out. I called Ms. Alvarez from the backyard, standing by the grill where Evan always burns the first batch of burgers every summer and then laughs and eats the burnt ones himself, and said, "I think I have something," and told her about the key and the unit and the flash drive and Ken's voicemail. And she said, "All right, here's what we're going to do." And her voice took on that crisp tone that settles me. "You will bring me copies of what you found, not originals. You'll hand nothing over to anyone except me or a lawyer you choose, not one Ken suggests. You will not mention my name to anyone, not even a hint. We're going to treat this like what it looks like." And I said, "What does it look like?" And she said, "Like someone was skimming off city contracts and someone else noticed." And I swallowed and looked up at the maple branch over our little patio and thought of the time we strung lights from this tree for Mia's birthday, and Evan spent an hour getting the knot just right. And then, of course, this is when the hassle of regular life interrupts, because Sam's coach texted that practice was moved to the Northfield, and could we bring the team's snacks? And I did, because life never pauses fully. It just expects you to keep moving while your insides rearrange. And at practice, I stood in the bleachers with the other parents making small talk while my brain raced, and Tasha looped her arm with mine and whispered, "How are you?" I heard the worst, and I smiled and said something automatic, and then she squeezed my hand and said, "Ken called me, because you know my brother does their printing. He said they found the ring, Nora, I can't even." And I went cold again because that detail felt like it was being spread like gossip and not like something that belongs to me, and I said, "Could we keep some details to ourselves?" And she bristled just slightly because Tasha operates by the rule that the way she shows love is to tell, to spread a net, to get 10 people mobilized to bring paper towels if you say you're out of them, which is useful for cleanups, but less so for secrets. And she said, "Of course." But her eyes shifted to the other bleacher mom, and I tucked the flash of that away the way you tuck a thorn you can't quite pull into your heel. That night, I set the kids up in their sleeping bags in Lena's living room and snuck back to the house to gather more clothes, and to see if my pendant necklace that Evan gave me on our 10th was still in the jewelry dish. The one shaped like a little leaf, because his realness had started to drift, like a balloon losing helium, and I needed something to anchor me. And as I stepped into the kitchen, I heard the faintest chirp from the alarm system. Like the kind of chirp it makes when someone opens a door really slowly. And every hair on my arms went up, and I stood very still and listened, and I heard the back gate creak. And then the click of the lock on the back door like someone who knows their way around locks. And I grabbed my phone and ducked into the hallway and hit 911 and whispered our address and told them I was outside the house and there was someone inside. And then I heard footsteps and the door to the garage closed, and when the patrol car's headlights finally swept across the front lawn, who was in my driveway but Greg, shirt thrown on hastily, waving at the officers and telling them he'd heard the alarm from his kitchen and came running. And he made a show of clearing rooms with the officers, which in other times would have been a comfort, and he told me he thought the lock looked like it had been jimmied near the strike plate. And he asked if anything was missing, and I said no, because I didn't know yet, and he clapped my shoulder and said, "Keep your chin up." And the officers wrote their report, and I pressed my fingers to the back door and felt the cool metal and wondered if it had always been this easy to slip into our lives. I didn't sleep again that night, because who can? And in the morning I set the kids up at Lena's with pancakes and markers and told them we were having a staycation, because I couldn't think of a better word for I'm trying to keep you safe, but I don't want to scare you. And then I went to a lawyer recommended by Pastor June, a gentle man with a kind face named Mr. Powell, and he listened and tapped his pen and said, "We can pause any death certificate proceedings for now," which was the legal piece of acknowledging that this might not be what it looked like. And he told me to send official notices that the estate of Evan Hale would not be making any transfers of property to any employer until the situation had clarified. And he said it in such calm Atwood tones that I started to cry a little in his office chair, and he slid over a box of tissues with a practiced gesture. And then, because the day hadn't done enough already, I got a text from an unknown number with a picture of a red scarf tied to the railing at the public library's children's section, and my heart pitched because that was our code, and the text simply said, 11, and I was already halfway there before I could talk myself into or out of it. I sat in my car near the library and watched people go in and out with their "I voted" stickers, and their tote bags with book quotes on them, and kids with hair still damp from baths because it's story time. And I waited until 11:07 because there's power in not arriving exactly when someone tells you to. And then I went in, and the world inside was quiet and smelled like paper and glue and crayons. And the red scarf was there, tied like a flag to the railing near the fish tank. And tucked beneath the base of the little plastic castle inside the tank, I saw the corner of a manila envelope, and I slipped my hand in like I was adjusting a flyer and pulled it out and walked calmly to the nonfiction stacks, and tucked behind biographies I opened it, and inside was a single sheet that said Greenhouse, in Evan's handwriting, and a tiny doodle of a campfire. And the campfire doodle took me out of the library for a second, and dropped me back into a memory of him sitting on a stool in our kitchen years ago, drawing that same doodle on Mia's lunch notes. And I closed my eyes and smiled like an idiot, and then opened them because this was not the time. And I texted Ms. Alvarez a picture of the note, and she wrote back quickly, "Old greenhouse on State. Don't go alone. Meet me at coffee shop at noon." And I wrote back, "Kids," and she said, "Bring them to the community center. Someone you trust can watch them. Then do not go anywhere near that greenhouse without me." And I listened because I had decided her was one of the voices I'd choose to follow. At the coffee shop with cracked vinyl chairs, and the usual endearing crowd of retired chess players and moms with strollers, and the guy who always orders the weirdest items, Ms. Alvarez laid out a simple plan. She would go into the greenhouse property with 2 investigators from the state who had been quietly mapping off Book's payments for months. I would wait at the park across the street with a lemonade and my phone, ready to call if I saw anything that looked like a rushed exit. The kids would be with Lena and her girlfriend, who has the magical ability to entertain children with a cardboard box, and I would take deep breaths and not go charging in because my instinct is to fix things quickly, and sometimes quickly is the wrong speed. We did as planned, and the greenhouse, which is really more of a rundown hoop house behind a garden store that went out of business 3 summers ago, turned out to be a dead drop, a place where things had been left behind shelves of cracked terracotta and bags of obsolete fertilizer, and hidden beneath a loose board was a ledger, the old-school kind with green lines and a carbon paper sheet still clinging like nostalgia, and I watched from the park while they moved carefully, gloved, patient. And I drank lemonade, and my hands shook so hard that I had to hold the plastic cup with both hands, And while I watched, a black SUV rolled slowly past, and I felt my scalp tingle, and I looked around for the way the SUV eyes us all with that blank gaze, and I saw the faint shape of a wreath on the driver's windshield like the kind pastors sometimes hang on their cars at funerals. And I took a picture and sent it to Ms. Alvarez, and she texted back, "Don't spook. Stay put. We'll be done in 5." And 5 minutes has never felt longer. And then, back at home, breathing like I'd run a race, the weight of the day sat on me and I moved through the motions. The laundry, the check-in from the school about the field trip, the email about the delayed start because of fog tomorrow. And then, while folding a tower of small t-shirts and mismatched socks, my knees folded under me and I sat right there on the laundry room tile, and I cried so hard my face hurt, not the pretty kind of crying. The kind that sounds like you're shaking loose and might break, because the room smelled like laundry detergent and Evan's flannel fell off the shelf and landed next to my leg like an invitation to grief. And I pressed my forehead to it and remembered silly things, like the time he wore it while carving pumpkins and got stringy pumpkin guts all over the sleeve, and told me he was going to retire it to the garage, and then never did. And I cried not just because I was afraid, but because I hated him for not warning me in person, for letting me think he was dead, for making me be the one to tell our kids they had lost a parent, for making me feel like the house itself was suddenly a place of whispering corners and dark windows. And then I sat up and wiped my eyes and took a long breath and recorded a voice memo, because that is what the therapist I saw after my dad died told me to do when feelings felt too big. And I said, "Okay, Evan, here's the day. Sam hit 2 doubles. Mia lost another tooth. Tasha bought me groceries I didn't ask for, and I am so grateful, but it overwhelms me. Ms. Alvarez found a ledger. A man in a black SUV circled. Our dog needs his nails trimmed. I am very, very mad at you, but I also understand a tiny part of me that knows you did what you had to do if you'll just prove it's you. Come home or send more than voicemails." And then I sat there until the kids thumped down the hall arguing over whose turn it was to sit in the front seat when we go to the grocery store. And it was such a normal argument that I laughed and said, "Rock, paper, scissors for it." And they did. And we left the house with lights on timers, and I tucked the flash drive inside the cereal box behind the bag of marshmallows, because we had started buying jumbo marshmallows to roast in the fireplace and then never did. And when we returned late because the grocery store felt surreal and I read labels like they were coded messages instead of ingredients, a note had been pushed through the mail slot, typed, weirdly formal. "Bring any company property, laptops. Notebooks to 113 Harbor Way by Friday or we will consider them stolen." And I took a picture, sent it to Mr. Powell. He texted back, "Do not comply." And then I took another picture and sent it to Ms. Alvarez, who wrote, "We anticipated this. They are escalating. We will too." And beyond that we fell into a rhythm of caution. Drop-offs with Lena, double-checking locks, resisting the impulse to call everyone and empty the story into their hands like that's how to lighten a load. I began to notice details I hadn't noticed before. The car that parked for an hour near the ball field with a driver who didn't get out. The same white cowboy hat at the hardware store twice in one day. A pair of boots under a bathroom stall, tapping. I don't live on shows or conspiracies, but living in a heightened way makes you see patterns in dust motes. And I would tell myself, maybe it's just a cowboy who likes tools. And then I'd remind myself that Evan told me not to trust, and I'd err on the side of standing one step back, just in case. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I decided to test where the leaks were, if there were leaks at all, and I printed out a few fake invoices, made them look very official with a watermark I found online and a case number and a funny little stamp that read, "Received," that I bought off the end cap in the office aisle once because it was on sale and I like stamps, and into a folder labeled C12. Rot, because I am not above cheap irony. I put the fake invoices and a note that said, "Keyfax." And then I invited Greg over for coffee because he texts in a slightly pushy way that says, "You should not be alone right now." And he came, and I made the good kind in the French press because hospitality dies last. And while I was in the bathroom, washing my hands for a little longer than necessary, my camera showed him glancing toward Evan's office and doing that thing nosy people do, that "I'm just seeing if she needs me to pick this up for her" approach. And then his hand slipped out like a magician's, and the folder slipped into his jacket, and I rinsed my hands long enough that it would feel real and then came out and offered him another cinnamon roll. And he said, "No, thanks." And then he left with his folder like he'd done me a favor. And I sat down and took 3 slow breaths and texted the video to Ms. Alvarez and typed, "Bait taken." And she wrote, "Excellent. Here's what we do next." And it was sudden, like how a storm moves from the edge of the horizon to right above you. You can smell it, ozone and cotton sheets on the line, and then it's there. The next day, Ken called and said, "Greg mentioned you had some files. If it's easier, I can swing by and pick them up. Save you the trip." And his voice had a burr of impatience that he was trying to hide under a layer of, "We're all on the same team, right?" And I said, sweet as sugar, "Actually, I think I'd prefer to give them to you in person. Today, at 5. Storage Unit C12. And there was a pause where I could hear him checking a calendar he wasn't really looking at. And he said, "Great, see you then." And I hung up and sat there with my hands open like I'd been balancing something heavy and had just set it down and felt the ghost wait still in my bones. At 4:40, I kissed the kids and told Lena it was just a quick errand and I'd be back in an hour. And the way she looked at me told me she didn't believe my timing at all, but she nodded and said, "Be careful. Text me when you're in, when it starts, when you're out." And I said, "Okay, Mom," because that's what you call your sister when she gets bossy. And I drove to the facility with the sun slanting and giving everything an oddly cinematic glow. And I parked under the security light and breathed slow and hard. And then I opened the unit and stood just inside like I wasn't blocking any view, and I laid the folder on top of the duffel like a prop on stage. And at 5:04, I heard footsteps. And the clang of the corrugated door next to mine, and then Ken's voice, smoother than buttering toast, "Nora." And then, "Greg," because of course Greg was with him, because this is how things travel, through networks of neighborly favors. And I smiled and said, "Right on time." And then Ken stepped closer and lowered his voice like he does when he thinks a woman's about to cry and he wants to be seen as kind. "This has been a very stressful time for you. Let me take this off your plate." And he reached for the folder and said, "That's company property." And I said, "Is it?" And then there was a rustle and men who had been part of Shadows stepped forward and said, calm and clipped, "Mr. Malone, Mr. Ashby, we need to talk." And there was a quiet chaos of limited movement as badges were shown and Ken's mouth opened and closed like he was calculating, and words were about to come out but not yet. And I leaned my shoulder against the cool metal of the unit and felt this wash of something that wasn't relief, exactly, but was close kin to it, and in the corner of my eye. In the dim space near the mop bucket, a figure stayed still, and then he shifted and I felt his presence like a change in the air. And there he was, Evan, thinner and rough around the edges, a shadow of beard he never grew because it itched, a cap pulled low, an ache in his eyes and a light that was him at the same time. And he raised one hand, just a little, and said, so soft only I heard it, "You did good, Nor." And I don't think I breathed for a full 2 seconds, and then I did the opposite. Breathing like I'd been underwater and had been told I had to swim for the surface but wasn't sure how far. And I stepped toward him and stopped because there was this hot pressure of 6 months and a day of not knowing whether to mourn or to hope. And I wanted to hit him and kiss him and collapse all at once. And what I did was reach out and press my hand flat to his chest, right over his heartbeat, and he covered my hand with his and whispered, "I'm sorry." And the apology sounded like something he'd been wearing on his tongue for days. And beyond us, the investigators moved quietly, doing their work, and a woman I hadn't met before but recognized as the quiet one who'd been at the greenhouse nodded at me with a not-quite smile that felt like a way of saying without saying, "See. Trust isn't dead." Later outside, by the chain-link fence where weeds shove up through the cracked pavement, Evan told me pieces of what happened between that morning. He kissed my head and now, like a man with a handful of marbles, and he has to drop them one by one so he doesn't lose the line of the story. How he'd been combing through invoices and saw that each project had an adjustment line that didn't match the cost overruns they'd had in the field. How 2 vendors didn't exist, not really, but checks to them were real enough. How he planned to go to the internal auditor, and the day he parked outside the office to do it, he found a small magnetic box under his truck that didn't belong, the kind you'd put a GPS tracker in, and he had a wave of cold so big he sat there and waited until it passed, and then he walked inside like nothing had happened and pretended to be normal until he could get to Ms. Alvarez because he had known her through the community center, and he sensed she would see past his flailing and give him a path forward. How he told her half and she asked for the other half, and in the window of time between, Ken called him in and said, "I need team players, not Boy Scouts," in a way that made the hair on the back of Evan's neck stand up. How someone followed him out after work and a black SUV parked half a block down from the kids' school pickup spot, and how he made a decision that the only way to get the bad ones to show their faces was to make them think they'd scared him off the board. And the accident at the interchange was a real accident, he said, and he brought a stack of invoices to show me where he'd planned to be that day. But the way they used his truck to tell me he was gone didn't feel like coincidence. So he ducked out early and left his wallet on the passenger seat and his ring in the little cup where he keeps spare change and drove another route, calling me from a borrowed phone hours later to keep me safe, to get me to step out of the reach of anyone who would come knocking and say the right words. And the part where he said he had planned to be the one to tell me, but that the chaos took over and he couldn't get near without eyes on him, made me so angry that I had to take a step away and stare at a weed pushing through pavement, so I could get the words back from the place in me that held them. And then I said, "You made me tell our kids you were dead." And he looked as crushed as I've ever seen him, and he said, "I know." And I didn't forgive him right then. Because forgiveness isn't something you hand out like cookies because the guest arrived. But I moved one half step toward it, and he told me that Ms. Alvarez and her team had kept him in a borrowed room near the fairgrounds, the ones that smell like hay and oil, and that he'd gone over every line of every invoice and built a map that connected people like Greg to a ring of heads and tails of a coin that had been flipping this city for years. And it was as unglamorous and unromantic as you'd expect. It involved bad coffee and cheap chairs and long emails typed at 2 in the morning, and him sleeping on a blow-up mattress and not calling me, because if he did he might not stop, and then we would be in deeper water than the life jackets we owned. And he didn't know how to tell me the truth without the truth endangering the one thing he was trying to protect, us. He asked about Sam and Mia, and I told him how Sam had taken out the garbage without being asked and started to pick up the slack in this small, quiet way that made me proud and broken, and how Mia bought a pack of stickers with a cardboard star in it and put it on the bathroom mirror and whispered, "Hi, Daddy," at it like if the star had eyes, they'd be his. And he shook with that kind of contained grief that men sometimes have when they are told to be strong, and they don't know what to put the strength on top of if not their own pain. And I reached up and touched him under the jaw like I used to do when he had a 5 o'clock shadow, and I wanted to make him laugh. And he did, this rusty laugh that sounded like it hadn't had room to live for a while, and I said, "Don't you ever do this to me again." And he said, "I won't." And we both knew that promises are easy and the keeping is hard, but it was a start. The days that followed were slow and strange because we couldn't tell anyone but a very small circle that he was alive, because the arrests had to stick, and the lawyers had to do their dance, and there are rules to this messy kind of honesty. And my mother-in-law, Janice, who can be a lot of person in a kitchen and likes to rearrange my spice cabinet when she's stressed, stood in my house with her arms crossed and said, "We can't hold a service without a body." And I thought of telling her right then and there, and I didn't. Which almost broke me because I don't like withholding. But I did, and she looked at me like I'd stolen the script she knew how to read and left her with a stack of blank pages, and she baked instead, and we ate slices of banana bread until we couldn't stand it. We met Evan in secret places that made sense to no one but us. The back corner of the ball field after practice, the church parking lot when everyone else was at choir rehearsal, the park near the river where Mia fed ducks and Evan sat tucked behind a tree and watched with his cap pulled low, whispering updates while the kids threw bread. And when it was finally safe enough for a reunion that wasn't stolen. We told the kids on a Saturday morning in a sunlit kitchen that smelled like pancakes and syrup and dog kibble, and we didn't do it like a movie with a grand entrance. We did it like we do most things. We sat them at the table and we told them we had made a mistake calling something an ending when it wasn't quite over, and then Evan stepped out of the hallway and said, "Hey, kiddos," in that half-choked voice, and Sam didn't cry, not right away. He stood up so fast the chair fell over and said, "No way." And then he tackled his dad the way he used to when he was 6, and they fell into a heap, and I think Evan bruised a rib and didn't care, and Mia stood very still, and then very carefully walked over and put her hand on his face like she was checking to see if it was a cutout. And then she wrapped her arms around his neck, and he lifted her, and both of them cried, and my knees trembled like I'd run a marathon, but I held myself upright because I wanted to watch them. I wanted to mark the moment with my eyes so I could replay it in the quiet times, like how you replay a line from a song, because it hits the part inside you where truth lives. After that, life had to be rebuilt, which is every bit as hard as the crisis and less dramatic, but just as important, and that might be the most honest thing I can say about it. We sat in a therapist's office with a clock ticking and said things like, "I felt abandoned, and I thought you were dead, and I felt like a failure and a hero at the same time, and I hate that I had to lie to our kids, and I hate that it made you lie to them." And a kind woman with a legal pad nodded and gave us words like repair and rupture and boundaries, which sound like things used to describe highways and garden fences, but turned out to also fit a marriage. And we smiled a lot in that small, painful way that people who have survived look at each other, the smiles that say, "We did this thing we didn't know we could do." And we set new rules like we were writing on a napkin in a diner and passing it back and forth. No secrets without a plan to tell. No more going alone to meet with strangers. And if a red scarf appears, it better be attached to a hat with a face under it, not a crisis. And we returned to our real community. The ones who had held us with casseroles and lawn mowing and prayers. But we were careful. Because trust isn't a light switch, it's a dimmer, and you turn it slowly until the room is as bright as feels right. And we went to the neighborhood barbecue where that one dad always tries to flip a burger with a spatula. He's not skilled with, and Evan took over and everyone laughed, and the laughter felt less like a shiver and more like a blanket. And we went to church and sang the songs with words about being carried, and I carried those words home and set them down like groceries on my counter and took comfort in their familiarity. And when Ken and Greg and a handful of others were taken in, and the details of their misdeeds made it into the paper without our names, folks asked me at the coffee shop, "Did you know any of them?" And I would shrug and say, "Small town," and then ask about their kids' recital. And I never, ever said what I really knew because not everything is for public consumption, and not everything heals when it's aired. Now, months later, I can stand on our porch with a mug of coffee while the dog haunts the bushes for squirrels and watch the morning unfold. The trash truck rumbling and waking the whole block, the school bus brakes squealing, the neighbor teen backing his sedan too fast, Miss June walking by with her visor and her purposeful stride. And I remember those days when I was told my husband was dead, and then my husband, with words we always laughed would belong to an old spy novel, warned me, "Trust no one." And I think about how in the end, it's not that I learned to trust no one. It's that I learned to trust carefully, to test and to watch, to lean into the people who show up without being asked and keep showing up, to keep the circle small but warm when it has to be, and to widen it out again when we're safe. And if you are hearing this and it sounds like a balance you could never find, let me just say, we are ordinary. We are two people who knew the smell of each other's coffee and the schedule of the school pickup line and the feel of inevitability when you are told terrible news. And we found a way, one small choice at a time, to stay a family in a world that asks you to be a dozen other things first. If this reached you the way it reached me when I finally sat down and let myself breathe, if it made you think about who you'd call and what you'd do, and who would show up with a paper plate of brownies when you needed it most, please tap like and subscribe so we can keep telling these stories and talking about what gets us through. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you heard a voice you thought you'd lost say, "Trust no one"?